Welcome to my talk about being a good corporate citizen in open source. First, I'll tell you a bit about me. I've spent more than 20 years working in the technology industry, and most of that time I've been working on open source projects from within a variety of different companies. I've been the director of community at Puppet and community lead for Intel's Open Source Technology Center. I also have a PhD from the University of Greenwich in London that I got by researching how people working at many different companies collaborate together within the Linux kernel. I'm currently working in VMware's open source program office, and I'm responsible for our open source community strategy. I'm also a board member of Open UK, which is focused on developing and sustaining leadership in open technology within the UK. I'm a governing board member and maintainer for the Linux Foundation's CHAOSS project, which is focused on using metrics to evaluate the health of open source projects. I'm also on the advisory board for Triad, which is a company that's involved in building dashboards for open source project health metrics. I ended up working in open source sort of accidentally. I managed to luck into a Unix sysadmin role at a local manufacturing company as my very first job out of university in the mid-90s. At that time, manufacturing companies really did not want to spend money on IT. So most of the tools that I used were open source. A few years later, when I was at Intel, I ended up on a project to look at which Linux developer tools, and especially the open source tools, were likely to be important or strategic for Intel in the future. Since I had used open source tools and I had a Unix background, which was similar enough to Linux, they threw the project in my direction. A huge part of the evaluation was related to the community. Is there an active community? Are there regular releases? Are there users for the tools? A huge part of this evaluation was based on that. And I started to get more and more fascinated with how these communities worked. When I first started using open source, how a bunch of random people threw code together and eventually ended up with something that not only worked, but worked really well, it was a bit of a mystery to me. After I started looking a bit more closely, I realized that there was indeed some structure with committers, maintainers, that just wasn't obvious looking in from the outside. And I started getting more and more fascinated by how open source communities worked. I started blogging about open source and speaking at conferences, which led me directly to my next open source job. And from there, the rest of my jobs have been focused mostly on open source communities. But enough about me. Let's go ahead and get started. Before we dive into talking about how your company and your employees should collaborate in open source projects, let's talk a bit about how collaboration works within open source projects and the complex interactions between individuals, companies, and communities that occur within these open source projects. While there are some exceptions, contributions to most open source projects are centered around the individual. Contributions come from individuals rather than companies. When someone submits a pull request to fix a bug, add a feature, or update some documentation in an open source project, the change comes from an individual. Commits usually include a name and an email address, but in many cases, unless the person uses their corporate email address, you can't even tell where a person works. To make this even more complicated for companies, in most open source projects, the leadership positions stay with the individual if that person changes jobs. This means that an employee can take their leadership position in a project to the next job. So companies are well served to make sure that these people are happy and well compensated. In some projects, like the Linux kernel, there is no direct way for companies to participate other than dedicating time from individual employees who contribute on behalf of the company, which is becoming increasingly common. When I worked at Intel, we had entire teams of people who worked full-time on open source projects like the Linux kernel, Android, KVM, and a whole bunch of others. We have something similar at VMware. where we have people working full-time on projects like Spring, RabbitMQ, Kubernetes, the Linux kernel, and a bunch of other open source projects. If you aren't sure how to contribute as a company, you might be able to hire an existing contributor or possibly even a maintainer as an employee to do work on the project on your behalf. And in addition to devoting time from your employees to the project, companies are also in a position to help open source projects by providing additional resources. Open source projects need funding or in-kind sponsorship for loads of things like infrastructure and legal representation. They also appreciate sponsorships for events and other activities. And I'll talk more about all of this later, since corporate involvement in open source is indeed the main focus for this presentation. Open source communities include a wide variety of individuals who are working together within open source projects. And when I talk about community, I'm really including all of the people who work on the project. This includes core product developers, release managers, quality assurance, localization, and other people who contribute to the project. Application developers who are using the API and other features to write applications, modules, or extensions that build on top of your project. Users, the people who run your software and hopefully provide some feedback. People working for vendors and companies who are creating their products based on your project. Other contributors include people working on promotion, organizing meetups, doing documentation, moderation, and all kinds of other sort of slightly thankless tasks. Some of these people contribute as part of their day job on behalf of an employer, while others contribute in their free time. And they're all important parts of the community. In open source communities, I've also had plenty of small world moments where people that I've worked with in past projects pop up again in other communities that I'm a part of. It's important to keep in mind that you're likely to run into these same individuals again and again. So be thoughtful and kind when working with others. If you're a big jerk in one community, it's likely that other people will remember this and they'll bring your reputation with them into new projects, which can reflect badly on you and on your company. As an employer, it really is worth doing a bit of due diligence to see how someone has behaved in previous open source communities before having them do work on your behalf. This individual employer community triad creates some unique challenges. As an individual contributing to an open source project, there will be times when you'll need to find ways to create balance between what your employer wants you to do and the right thing for the community. In open source communities, you can't force the community to do something. So during these conflicts, you need to err on the side of doing the right thing for the community, which can create really awkward and uncomfortable conversations with your manager and your company. The worst case scenario is when there are direct conflicts and what your employer wants you to do would go against the best interest of the project and the community. At times like these, you need to be diplomatic. It can help to ask some questions, to understand what your company needs to accomplish, to see if you can find another creative way to meet this need in a way that does align with the needs of the community. Sometimes this won't be possible, and you'll need to go back to your company to explain why what they want isn't going to happen, which is one of those really awkward and uncomfortable conversations. As an employer, you can make this easier on your contributors by taking the time to understand the types of contributions that will be welcomed by the community. It's important to have regular conversations with your contributors to understand what the project needs and learn how you can work within the community. You can help your employees be successful by being careful not to push your employees to do things that aren't in the best interest of the community. Personally, I've been in a couple of situations where I've left companies because of this conflict in other open source projects. And I know lots of other really amazing people who've done the same thing. Helping your employees avoid these conflicts in the first place will help you retain great talent. Okay, now that we have a better idea of how collaboration works for open source projects and companies, next up, let's talk about how to build a contribution strategy and plans for participating in these open source projects. The most important part of putting together strategies and plans for your open source contributions is aligning them with the overall business goals for your company. If your open source engagements don't support the overall strategies for your organization, you will drastically reduce the chances of being successful. By taking some time and effort to make sure you support the overall corporate strategy, then it will be much easier to justify continuing these efforts during the next planning cycle for your organization. On the other hand, when your goals are not clearly aligned with the overall strategy, people will look at your open source participation as something that can be cut or just starved of resources. This will also help you make the case to senior management and company executives who are not likely to be involved in the low-level details of your projects. Explaining how your open source contributions support the goals of the company will help your exec team understand the importance of the work. Now, while some employees might see collaborating on open source software to be its own reward, having a solid strategy can also help employees understand how their open source work contributes to the success of the company. As an employee, it's really nice to see that your work is having an impact and is meaningfully contributing to helping the company achieve their goals. One of the things you'll need to decide is which projects you should be contributing to. While this may sound easy, you can just contribute to the open source projects you use. If you're like every company I've ever worked for, this is likely to be hundreds, if not thousands of projects, and you are not likely to have the people to contribute to all of them. For many of the big, complex open source projects, like the Linux kernel, like Kubernetes, you probably also need to think about which part of the project you should contribute to. This is where thinking about company strategy comes into play again. Which of these open source projects are strategic in some way for your company? Maybe there are some projects that your operations team uses to run some of your critical business infrastructure. Are there any development or deployment tools that impact your ability to release the products that generate revenue for your organization? Is there other software that is important for your ability to deliver customer-facing products and services? And all of these areas, among others, should be considered when deciding which open source projects your employees participate in. You should also look at where you've already contributed to open source projects. In some cases, you might have employees who've already fixed bugs or added new features or functionality to an open source project to meet some previous company requirement or need. After you've decided which projects to support, you'll need to figure out which resources are required. As I mentioned earlier, companies contribute to open source projects by having employees participate and collaborate within those projects. So you'll need to figure out how many people you need for each project and what skills are required for those people. In some cases, you might have employees with the skills you need who have already contributed to open source projects in the past, which makes a really good starting point for new contributions. But the thing to keep in mind is that contributing to open source projects will require some different skills than participating in internal projects. These people need to be comfortable in really ambiguous environments where they will receive feedback, possibly difficult or negative feedback, and they'll be expected to respond to this feedback in the public in a professional manner. And keep in mind that not every engineer wants their work to be in the public spotlight, which can feel a bit like being under a microscope sometimes. If you don't have the skills internally, you might be able to find existing contributors that you can hire. But you need to be a bit careful about this option too, because you don't want to get a reputation within an open source project for really aggressively poaching employees from other companies. And it takes a bit of nuance to make it known that you're interested in hiring people to work on an open source project without aggressively hiring them away from other employers. In some projects, you can gain additional influence in a project by sponsoring or becoming a member. So for example, companies who join the Hyperledger project at the premier level get to appoint a person to the governing board, amongst some other benefits. Now, many open source projects do not have an option where you can pay for influence, but you do see this in some open source projects that are focused more on corporate concerns. So it might be worth exploring if you want to be heavily involved in a project where this is an option. You should also think about what guidelines or processes you might want to put in place to help people engage in open source projects in ways that work well for your organization. These often contain guidance about licensing, avoiding accidental disclosure of confidential information, and internal review processes, just to name a few. Now, my caution about guidelines and processes is that they can be written in ways that discourage contributions. When they heavily use very scary legal jargon with an emphasis on how you're going to punish people when something goes wrong. Instead, you're often better off writing the guidelines in ways that help engineers understand what you need them to do and why, in language that can be really easily understood. And bonus points for actually making it easy for your employees to contribute to open source projects. If you're planning to have a lot of open source collaboration across many projects, then it might make sense to build an open source program office to help manage the process and be a resource for your contributors to get help and guidance. In a lot of cases, these start with a single person and grow from there as needed, so they can be pretty flexible. And you may or may not need this depending on the scope of your efforts. As with any good strategy and plans, the outcome and results should be measurable so that you can tell whether your efforts were successful. I'd love data, so measuring open source project success is kind of a hobby for me. And it's something that personally I'm pretty passionate about. So I tend to get a lot of questions about it. Usually the questions are focused on how to decide what to measure. And I think for a lot of reasons, this is kind of the wrong question. And my answer is always the same. It depends. What you measure depends on what you're trying to achieve, which is why this slide is in the strategy and planning section of the presentation. Ultimately, you need to look at your strategies and plans to come up with criteria that will help you measure whether or not you're successful. For example, if you want to improve the performance of a particular piece of open source software, you'll want to have success criteria and measurement based on specific types of performance. If you want to gain influence within an open source project, maybe you measure increases in contributions or the number of employees moving into positions of influence. Once you figure out the criteria, you need to make sure that you can get the data required to measure it and start measuring it now to get a good baseline. There are loads of tools available to gather contribution data about open source projects. Some of the commonly used tools can be found in the Linux Foundation's CHAOSS project. And many big projects already have dashboards using these tools and other tools to display contribution data for the project. I also recommend doing a bit of over measuring and gathering as much data as you possibly can about your participation so that if your strategy shifts in the future, you're more likely to have some baseline data to start out with. And having some extra data can also help you investigate other ideas for how you might want to improve your participation in the project at some point in the future. Now that you figured out what to do, let's talk about how to do it while being a good corporate citizen and avoid some common but embarrassing mistakes. The first step is to join a project. Every project is different, so what you need to join the community will vary, but this can usually be found by having a look at the website or the documentation, and it's typically found in some kind of contributor or community documentation. Usually this would include some type of mailing list, IRC, Slack, or other communication channels. You'll also want to find the repos where the source code can be found, since that's also where a lot of discussion tends to happen. And you can also start having a look at it to get a feel for the structure and how people typically make contributions. These days, the code's usually, but not always, somewhere like GitHub or GitLab. You'll also want to have a close look at the project documentation, again, especially the contribution docs. Spend whatever time it takes to fully understand the contribution guidelines, the code of conduct, and other expectations for collaboration within this particular project. The expectations for contributors are different for each project, so don't assume that you know how to contribute, even if you have experience with other open source software contributions. I also recommend taking some time to lurk in the community and understand how people participate. I have seen way too many overeager new community members jump into the community with both feet, and they make mistakes. They violate community norms. They talk about things that aren't relevant, and they just generally sort of make a mess of things. Everybody makes mistakes at some point, but some of them can be avoided by taking the time to learn about the community rather than just barging in and trying to be an active participant on day one. Don't be afraid to sit back while you learn from other community members. By taking the time to observe and lurk for a bit, you can learn about how people behave and get a feel for how people typically respond. When you've spent some time understanding the expectations and how to contribute, then you should start with something small. I've seen companies spend a ton of time working on huge new features internally, and then they sort of dump them into the community as one massive contribution that no one was expecting, and frankly, no one probably wanted. And in many cases, this is just a waste of time for everyone involved, since the contribution is unlikely to be aligned with the project goals or the contribution expectations. The company and the employees have wasted time contributing something that may require a ton of rework, or at worst, just never, ever be accepted. And the maintainers will need to spend a bunch of time reviewing it and explaining why certain parts of it, or even worse, all of it, just aren't acceptable for the project. You're better off starting with some small things like bug fixes to learn about the contribution process. Once you start participating, you should expect feedback. Sometimes the feedback will be kind, other times not so much. As much as you might want to just fire back, you're only likely to start a flame war, which is going to reflect badly on you as an individual and on your employer. It's better in the long run to wait to respond until you can cool off a bit. And even when the feedback is harsh, there will be things you'll need to do to rework your contribution to make it acceptable. So you really need to stay focused on what changes you need to make in your contribution. And in some cases, you may need to have hard discussions with people about the merits of your contribution. But you can focus on the problem, deliver your response with a bit of kindness while avoiding any attacks on the other person. It can also help to have someone else read your response before you post it publicly, to help catch any issues with tone that might make you sound more harsh than you think you do. This is an incredibly difficult line to walk sometimes, but staying professional and being kind to other people while responding to difficult feedback can make a big difference to your personal reputation and the reputation of your employer within open source communities. In many cases, especially when you're new to a community, you should expect to iterate on the feedback. After you submit your changes to accommodate the first wave of feedback, you're likely to get more feedback on the changes you just made. So just consider it an iterative process. This also means that you should plan for the time it takes to get multiple waves of feedback. Submitting something at the last minute, right before a release window closes and expecting it to be included is going to be frustrating for everyone involved. So just give yourself plenty of time for this multiple feedback and resubmit process. After you get past those first few small contributions, you'll want to make sure that you spend time discussing these proposed changes in the community before you start making them. By talking about contributions very early in the process, you can get feedback on ways to architect the changes so that they'll be consistent with the expectations of the project. You can also learn about anyone else who might be working in similar areas to hopefully avoid conflicting changes that won't work together when they're merged into the project. These discussions also help avoid surprising people, especially for new features or other really big changes. It can also help to break big changes into several smaller, easier to digest contributions. It's a lot easier for maintainers to find time to provide feedback on small contributions, and it gives you time to make corrections if anything you're doing just isn't quite right. This allows you to iterate on the feedback through several contributions, making it less likely to have bigger fundamental issues. It's also important to keep in mind that you don't really have any control whatsoever over other participants in the project. This is different from working within a company where you can escalate any issues to managers who can work to resolve problems with non-responsive employees. In open source projects, you don't have a strict chain of command or other ways to exert control over the people you collaborate with. Instead, you should strive to be kind and easy to work with, since you may need to find other ways to influence people to respond to your patches or your pull requests. Community members, and especially leaders within the community, should expect to spend some time helping to bring up the next wave of new contributors. And as employers, we should plan to have our contributors put some effort into this. This could mean having employees who are experienced contributors mentor junior employees and help them get started in the community. Or it could mean participating in the mentoring programs that might already be available within your community. Within the Kubernetes project, for example, we have Meet Our Contributors, which is a meeting where anyone can join and ask questions of experienced contributors. We also have shadow programs where a new person can shadow an existing contributor in a specific role, with the goal of helping contributors eventually grow into leads for the roles that they're shadowing. Whenever you can, you should try to find opportunities to sponsor new contributors. Now, this term is a little bit confusing since a lot of people think of financial sponsorship, but in this case, it means using your position in the project to advocate for someone who might not otherwise have the same opportunities as you did. This can be as simple as recommending someone to help out with some part of the project, or recommending someone as a new reviewer or approver. And it's especially important for underrepresented folks that might have been overlooked or who might not be as forthcoming about asking for a leadership role. A lot of the work that we do in open source projects is based on the relationships we have with other people. Now, my PhD research was based on collaboration in the Linux kernel, and as part of that research, I interviewed a bunch of kernel developers. In all of the interviews, they talked about the importance of their relationships with other people. Almost all of them talked about how existing relationships made it easier to collaborate with others. All of the people I interviewed mentioned in-person collaboration at conferences and other meetings as being something that was important. People talked about how it's sometimes easier to work through really difficult big issues at conferences. And it's easier to communicate with someone online if you've met them before and maybe shared a meal or a drink or just had a nice conversation with them at an event. Knowing the human being on the other side of the keyboard can make a bigger difference than you might realize. If your employees are working on open source projects, then you should see if there are any conferences where large numbers of community members attend. By having some key employees attend those conferences, they can build deeper, lasting relationships with others that will benefit your company and your employees. I have spent a lot of time at open source conferences over the years, and I have deep and lasting connections with people that I've met at those events. Now, when I need to do something new or have a question, I usually know someone who can point me in the right direction. And I often make introductions for other employees to people outside of the company who can help us learn something new or solve some tricky issue. Now, this whole going to events and meeting people in person is a bit more challenging right now for obvious reasons, but we have events like this, we have virtual events, and we can make the best of the situation to do some networking as much as we possibly can within the confines of the virtual environment as well. Upstreaming your patches also helps you become a good corporate citizen, but it also has quite a few internal benefits for your company. If you aren't familiar with upstreaming, this just means that when you make patches to fix a bug or solve some internal need, you submit those updates back into the open source project rather than just continuing to maintain them internally. When you maintain patches internally, every time the open source project releases fixes or other updates, you need to go through the work of reapplying your patches and possibly even rewriting some of your patches if they touched bits of code that were changed in one of the updates. Now, the side effect of this sometimes difficult process is that people tend to put off applying updates, which can be a big problem if those updates contain security fixes. While it takes more time up front, you're better off taking the time to submit these patches into the open source project where they can be properly maintained as part of the project and where other people can benefit from them. The easier you make it for your employees to contribute these changes back into open source projects, the better off you'll be. In general, upstreaming patches is considered the right thing to do within open source projects, which again helps you maintain your company's status as a good corporate citizen. Understanding maintenance expectations is also a big part of being a good corporate citizen. Putting large chunks of code into an open source project, disappearing, and then just expecting someone else to maintain it reflects very poorly on your organization. If you fix a small bug or just make some minor changes, it's not likely that you'll be expected to maintain those changes over the long term, since someone else is likely responsible for maintaining that thing that you fixed or tweaked. Where you really need to think about this is when you're making large contributions, like a new feature or a new driver. You need to make sure that your employees are planning to maintain the code over the long term before you contribute it to an open source project. If you want to open source a project because it has no users, it's old, it's crusty, and you don't want to maintain it anymore, please don't do this. Just don't do this. Dumping your project into the open source community and hoping that someone else will be just dying to take it over and help you out is at best a wee bit naive and generally makes your company look bad. So make sure that you're open sourcing a project for the right reasons. For example, a desire to collaborate with other people and innovate on your project. That's a good reason to open source it. If a project will need to integrate with other technologies, open sourcing it can make it easier for people to help you integrate it with technologies that you are less familiar with. As I mentioned earlier, your company needs to be prepared to maintain the project over the long term, just as you would with something you released under a proprietary license. Now, this will take time and it'll take resources, so you need to plan for that. Where I see companies drastically underestimate the amount of effort required is usually related to the time it takes to collaborate with the community. You'll need to have people available to answer questions, to discuss new features, to provide feedback on new contributions. Every company I've ever worked for has at one time or another struggled to manage incoming pull requests for open source projects, since it takes quite a bit of time to evaluate contributions and provide good quality feedback. The people working on pull requests need to be comfortable providing really tough feedback. The reality is that some pull requests will contain poor quality code or possibly never be merged because of some fundamental conflicts with the direction of the projects. It's easy to ignore these and just sort of hope they'll go away. Pro tip, they won't. And this pile of neglected pull requests just makes you look like a bad corporate citizen. It's important that employees respond to these in a way that's clear about the future of that contribution, but also shows empathy and appreciation for the hard work that someone put into that contribution. While it's tough and it's not always realistic, keeping up with pull requests show that you care about the community, and it really helps with your good corporate citizen standing. Here are a few resources that people might find useful. The To-Do group has a bunch of guides that are useful for open source program offices, and they have specific guides for starting open source projects and recruiting developers. GitHub also has a bunch of really good guides, and these are not guides for using GitHub. They have guides about starting open source projects, building welcoming communities, and best practices for maintainers. OpenSource.com has a bunch of frequently asked questions and guides, including how to promote your project, building community, and licensing. And these are all really great starting places for getting ideas about how to improve your open source projects and become a better citizen within open source. With that, I will say thank you so much for attending my presentation.